I want to be clear here. When I say speeding up combat, I do not mean getting combat over with. I love a good encounter. Fighting is fun, and I think it should be a focus in D&D. I say speeding up combat as in keeping combat moving, making sure your players don't get bored in between their turns, and making sure the tension doesn't die out. We're talking about picking up the pace of combat, not trying to make encounters shorter. In fact, you can actually have longer encounters by speeding things up. Longer in the sense of they take more rounds to reach a conclusion. If your average encounter goes for 4 rounds right now, you might be able to fit a 6-round combat in that same amount of time if you actively do things to pick up the pace. Step 1. Trim down your stat blocks when and where you can. This isn't always a viable option, but if there's fat to cut, cut it. You want to fight with a Morkoth? Cool, let's grab one. Well, on top of an entire stat block, this thing has 20 spells at its disposal, all with a paragraph or 2 of text. This includes some cool-ass spells like Chain Lightning. It also includes Scrying, Sending, and Identify. All great spells for a Morkoth to have, don't get me wrong. They just aren't spells you'll end up using in combat. If I want to run a Morkoth as a recurring bad guy, this is great information to know. I can use them to help shape the story leading up to the party's encounter with it. But once we get into combat, I want that stuff gone to declutter the page. Also, it has access to Shocking Grasp, Acid Spray, and Witch Bolt. I'm removing those two, because I would never make this monster use them. They are worse than the Morkoth just flailing its tentacles for its turn in all but the most niche scenarios. So why even bother giving myself the chance to consider it? Now we end up with a stat block that has 9 spells, all of which are fairly straightforward. It's a lot cleaner, and I know what relevant spells the Morkoth has access to at a quick glance. One issue you might have seen is that my parameters ended up taking off all of this thing's 5th level spells. That's fine. We could add more if we wanted and not affect this monster's balance much. We could also remove more if we wanted it to be even further streamlined. After all, how many rounds do you think combat with this thing will last? How many spells is it actually going to end up casting? It probably doesn't need 20 options. Hell, it might not even need 9. But that's up to you. It can have as many options as you need. You just don't need it to have more than you need. You might also consider swapping out some of these spells with ones that are more familiar to you. Familiarity can go a long way in speeding up your combat. That way you don't have to read the full description of each spell every time you go to use it. It's fun to play with new tools, but too many at once can be confusing. Make sure your stat blocks don't overload you in that sense. Speaking of familiarity, if you already know something and you don't feel like you need a reminder, you can remove that too. I know a Morkoth is amphibious. I mean, look at the thing. It's like a squid monster. It's so heavily implied by the creature's design, it's very difficult to forget. I don't think I could ever possibly forget that. So it's gone, and I've saved a little bit more space. When designing homebrew creatures, I try to keep all this stuff in mind while I'm building them, giving each brew only a couple special traits. That way I can keep track of them all. If I make a cool ability, I keep the rules surrounding it fairly simple. Leads to less error and less rules confusion means faster combat. I mostly use digital tools when I'm running my games, so trimming down stat blocks is very easy for me. I can literally edit them or click a big old delete button to get rid of whole sections. But if you're reading straight from the book, consider using sticky notes as a way to white out sections you don't need or rewrite things like that spell list. Don't overthink turns. Go with your gut. Some tables do require some thorough thinking. There does exist a combat-oriented style of play out there that demands you use optimal strategy every turn, where the DM is trying to lay on the challenge thick, and one mistake can spell disaster. Are you at one of those tables, though? As a DM, is that the environment you're trying to curate? For most of us, it's probably not important to run combat in that way, where every single monster is doing their best possible thing every single turn. Especially when you run simpler creatures like skeletons, who boil down to swing the sword or shoot the bow. Don't second guess yourself. If you get a good idea, make the monster do that. It's probably better to just keep the game moving than to do the craziest possible stuff. I try and follow this mentality as both a player and a DM, but it has way more impact as a DM. Obviously, you're taking a lot more turns in that seat, but also by shaving off time on NPC turns, I've been able to let players take more time when they need to. People at the table have a lot more patience for those longer turns, and I think it's because long turns don't pile up on top of one another anymore. They just happen occasionally. Roll your dice together. Dear God, please roll your dice together. This is the simplest way to save a ton of time. It takes quite a while to roll a die, ask, does a 27 hit, and wait for a response, and then move on from there. If our Morkoth has 3 attacks, let's assign each one to a different d20 and roll them all at once. Count your hits, and then roll damage as you need. Any damage that was dealt to a single target can also be combined into a single roll. If you want to make rolling even faster and you have matching sets of dice, which I have very few of, so pardon me if this visual isn't quite perfect, you can roll your damage dice and your attack rolls all at once. If a d20 hits, count up the damage dice from the matching set and just ignore the dice that match misses. This is a very easy to implement way to really speed things up and keep the players feeling the moment. You weigh things down way less with numbers talk. One of the most common things I've heard is to use less NPCs. Don't throw too many monsters into the mix. I find that advice fairly unhelpful. Don't get me wrong, it might be the single most impactful thing you can do to speed up your encounters. But it feels like a band-aid solution, one that doesn't apply all the time. Large encounters with tons of enemies can be a lot of fun, and that's when doing things to pick up the pace matters the most. Instead of avoiding large encounters, I encourage you to find ways to manage the numbers better. The simplest thing? Group like enemies together. You have a fight where you're running 6 skeletons that all use the exact same stat block? Well, don't roll 6 different initiatives, just roll once and they'll all go together. You've probably heard that before, but are you taking their whole turns together? The entire turn, mush it into one. It's a group turn. Follow those previous points and don't overthink it. These 2 skeletons go here, these 3 here, and this one here. They all attack? Cool. Assign your dice and then roll 60-20. Count your hits, do your damage. There you go. We just went through 6 skeletons' turns almost in real time, sans a few fancy descriptions and counting up damage dice. For an enemy as simple as a skeleton, that's all you need. It's what they do on their individual turns anyways, so you can speed up the pace of combat without sacrificing anything. Actually, sometimes I think it can add to a game, by increasing that feeling of a horde acting like a true horde. No longer are zombies going to approach you one by one. The entire pack will swarm you at once, like they're known to do. Soldiers won't break away from their formation to get up to you. They all move up together, as a unit. If you want to simplify things even further, you can cut out rolling damage altogether and just use the average damage per hit. This isn't something I really like to do because I just prefer rolling for damage, most people do. But if a fight is really, really big, all the time it takes to roll up your damage and do that basic math does add up. Yes, I am bad at basic math and it takes me a while. In a similar vein, you can also use stuff like minion rules to cut down on more bookkeeping. I'm not going to go in depth on minion rules because it's been covered to death, but I will leave a link in the description that goes over it in a bit more detail in case you haven't actually heard of it before. But whatever you can do, like minion rules, the average damage roll, to just cut down on bookkeeping, to do less pencil scratching, please do it. Because the less you focus on pencil scratching, the more you get to focus on actually playing the game. And finally, something that doesn't technically speed up the pace of combat, but still effectively gets the same job done, is focusing on the narrative. Or, more objectively speaking, focusing on whatever makes the game fun for your table. For me, that's often the narrative. So I like to evolve the story as an encounter goes on, keeping up the momentum by creating moments in combat. This is something that helps maintain tension and my players' investment in the game, as combat constantly feels like it's moving towards something. It feels like it's going somewhere, even if I'm technically taking more time up by yapping all the time. But my players who aren't even actively taking a turn will have something to listen to and engage with. And you can do this for whatever it is that your table wants to get out of combat. Is it tactical decision making? Okay, focus on creating opportunities for them to make decisions. Find ways to change up your fights and give them tough choices to consider. Maybe your group just loves doing tons of damage and rolling as many dice as they possibly can. Awesome. Lower your average AC, increase your hit point totals, add in explosive barrels, and crazy ways to just go all out. Pinpoint the fun, and then exploit the fun. That is what we're speeding up everything else to get to. So once you get to it, focus on it. As something of a tie-in / counterpoint, sort of, to focusing on the narrative, I also suggest you cut out descriptive fluff. Yes, it is common advice to add in descriptions to your combat to make things more interesting, and it works. It is something you should do. It is something I love to do. I love getting colorful when I'm describing my attacks and spells. It is a big part of the game for me. But you can over-describe things, especially if you've run out of stuff to say. We all have limits, and we all have off days. Forcing yourself to come up with some kind of description you simply don't have can feel stunted and awkward and slow. If you can't find something interesting to say, keep it short, or maybe just don't say anything at all. because if you try and add filler, it'll feel like filler. Find what methods work for you when you need to cut back, and do not feel bad about using them. You do not have to be an award-winning author with each swing of an orc's axe. It's fine to relax a little bit, sometimes preferable. Yes, dialogue during combat can be fun. It can add a ton to the story and be a great way to develop the narrative as a fight pushes on. You don't have to say something every turn, though. Don't force a line where there doesn't need to be one. Instead, focus on putting your descriptions and dialogue where they matter, when something calls you to speak on it. The evil warlord knocks a player unconscious. That's a big moment, one that demands a spotlight. Said player gets back up later on in the fight. Okay. Does the warlord have a shift in focus? Do his eyes dart to the player getting up, and he changes his stance, getting ready to charge so he can put that person down for good? Or maybe he curses under his breath about the party having a damned cleric, and his ire draws there instead. These kinds of descriptions communicate something to the players. There's an impact with this dialogue. It shows a change in something. Be it a change in character, the narrative, a change in tactics. There's a change in something. It's not just talking for talking's sake. Keep the meat, but cut the fluff. Doing all of these things and just generally keeping a mentality of trying to get to my players' turns as quickly as possible has been great. Combat is innately more fun, especially during that period of time where I was only able to play D&D once every 3 months or so. Yeah, we all wanted to get into fights, of course we did. But having one fight take up the entirety of the only session you got sucked. Hard. If there's anything you do to help push the pace of combat, leave it down below as you support the channel with a comment, which can then be followed up by all that other stuff you know about too. And if you're feeling extra generous, that comment can have some color with the donation. Ooh, color! I love color. You love colors. I love getting money. You hate having money. All around, it's just a great deal.